Morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our Culinaria Food Symposium, which is also the first public event in our exciting new international research collaboration with the University of Bologna. And while Culinaria has spearheaded this collaboration, it is obviously open to everyone at the UFT, and we're really looking for a wonderful partnership between our Italian colleagues and ourselves in food studies, food history, food anthropology, sociology, and beyond. Before we turn to our exciting panel today on global histories of drink, I want to actually ask the first speaker, Dan Bender, to put on his hat as Associate Fellow of Victoria College, which is also Victoria University, and explain a little bit about where Victoria College comes into this new relationship and why we think that for once it is the suburban campus of Scarborough that led the way, but we are really looking to take new food studies with collaborations with and others to new levels. Thank you. Over to Dan.
So thanks, Joe. So just very briefly, this is Victoria College within Victoria University, within the University of Toronto, a level of bureaucracy that only Italians can understand. So there'll be a test on this later. But this is Vic has been, we teach a range of food courses here. Anna Romantic, who teaches courses in Italian food studies here, Italian foodways here, and has been for several years. And
actually, I do the course in Siena.
She teaches it in Siena through Vic. Again,
no, through study of art.
Close enough. Absolutely. And we do teach a material culture of food course. I teach one of my wine courses downstairs. There's been a great deal of support from the Vic College administration and leadership for expanding what we do in food studies here. And I think we'll have a chance to actually meet the Victoria University president, hopefully tomorrow. She'll be able to join us with it tomorrow, hopefully. Either way, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to one of the oldest buildings in the University of Toronto, which should make our Italians working at 14th century university chocolate. So thanks and welcome. Should I just dive into this?
Yes, so now we have Dan Bender in his capacity as the global historian of drink. With his presentation, there's a slight change in the title. Instead of wine and jobs, it's wine and ruins.
Yes, indeed, and professional drinker as well. Drunk, not drink, drinker, drunk. So it's just as a caveat here, I'm not an Italianist. I'm a food studies scholar interested in both labor, environmental, and increasingly wine studies. I'm also a wine student who has, as Joe knows, spending an enormous amount of time professionally spitting as I'm pursuing and have gotten various certifications. And this is part of my overall interest in how we think about taste. So it's an advanced sip of the new project. You guys had a chance to hear the older project. This is the new material. So the next slide there. So I'm talking about this region today, the Alto Piemonte, which is in the region of Piemonte. Just to locate you in space here, for those of you who know, this is Turin here, and the better known wine regions of Barolo and Maderesco here, and we are up in that greenish area in the foothills of the Alps. This is about a 30 to 40 kilometer. Hey, come on in. Thank you so much. Can I just pause to introduce?
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, so
I love to make it clearly sneaking in quietly.
So to pause, and our president, Ron McEwen.
Hi, everyone. Absolutely, my pleasure.
So these are students, scholars, postdocs from across Culinaria and our visitors also from the University of Bologna as part of
Welcome.
a new collaboration.
Oh, fantastic. Well,
we are-
welcome. As I said, I'm just gonna go and quietly sit over here, but it's my pleasure to welcome you here. I know you're in great hands, but I'm here to listen and learn. This is not my research area, but I'm so
Would you like it?
fascinated. Yeah, I've been trying to rope you in for some time now, but thank you.
So it is about a 40-kilometer wide zone from the town of Biella, the former industrial city of Biella here, and about another hour drive to Paolo's hometown of Milano, to the east. So we begin in July of last year, when I was there in this little strip here of Lissona, in the midst of an unprecedented drought. Lissona is part of one of the many denominations, the denominazione, of the larger Alto Piemonte wine region. And today, the different wines of this area are incredibly hard to find even in Piemonte, though I served you one yesterday. And if you want to try some, come to my house. But as early as the 14th century, noted one winemaker to me, this area produced Italy's best known quality wines made from Nebbiolo, the great Nebbiolo. And the story I'm told across this region is that wines from Lissona were served at the banquet celebrating the reunification of Italy in 1861. And over the course of last year, in the midst of one of the warmest, hottest, driest, most difficult years on record, I visited wineries, tasted, walked through the forests and the vines, and talked to winemakers and their staff in each of the principal denominazioni of this region. In the towns themselves, I stood outside of factories, mostly abandoned, where locals once gave up growing grapes for wage labor. Thanks, Joel. In the middle of that vineyard in Lissona, I was watching Popillia, iridescent, invasive beetles about the size of a thumbnail. And they were slowly moving along the chute. And below them were the still green grape clusters. The Popillia are spreading rapidly in the area. They eat the leaves, green tissues, and leave behind skeletal leaf ribs. I'm reminded of the broken windows of abandoned factories, and there's a reason why. In the Alto Piemonte, the detritus of fine wine, industrial rise and fall, and natural disaster is etched everywhere, from the biology of the vine roots to the forest floor to the city streets. And wine is good to think ruins with, and ruins can produce glorious wine. Ruins are now a thing, a place. They're also a verb, as a growth decay process. To ruin focuses less on the productive elements of capitalism than on its destructive. The actions of a generation, whether that might be the construction of a factory or the planting of vines, creates the terrain, a very real historical sediment upon which future generations of people, animals, microorganisms, and plants must subsist and interact. And today's winemakers nurture vines and vinify grapes on the debris, the literal debris of the past. The ruination of a region comes in stages, sometimes rapid cataclysms like the eating of a plant, sometimes slow transformations. And phylloxera, that invasive aphid that feeds on vine rootstock and wiped out most of Europe's Vitis vinifera in the 19th century, arrived in Italy first in the Alto Piemonte. Showing you two images here, one of an abandoned factory in the town of Gattinara, and next to it, a forest. And I'll explain to you the ruins that we see there. Earlier in the year, just around flowering season, I visited a winery in Boca to the east of the region. It's an old building that looks older. The front garden is overgrown, paint peels. The building itself feels abandoned, except that I have an appointment. But before we visit the vines or taste, the winemaker talks through oversized photographs that chronicle the disappearance of the vine. This is the winemaker you tasted yesterday. From around 40,000 hectares in the entire region in the 19th century to just 700 today. The photographs that he shows me are the first stop in a winery tour that impels a sensory dialogue with the human history of inheritance law and the labor history of factory work, alongside an environmental history of hail in the clouds and phylloxera in the soil. In 1879, the eve of the time that this region was hit by phylloxera, the region produced about 324,000 hectoliters of vine, despite phylloxera that had actually grown to 600,000 by 1900. And 5 years later, there was a devastating hailstorm. At another winery, the one that you see on the edge of the picture of the forest, I spent more time with the winemakers walking the forest than amidst their vines. And in ordered rows, vines speak about progress, resilience, tradition. And winemakers view a forest like this one as loss and debris, not resurgent nature. These trees, he was telling me, are weeds, not something rewilded. And they pointed to that what looks like a hill in the background. It isn't. It's an overgrown vine terrace. And they pointed to these stones here, which I had not even noticed, but what those stones were markers of landholding. And over the years, a landholding that was already small to begin with had been divided with each generation into something so small as to be beyond use. A winery grows with a family. It subdivides through inheritance in the next generation. And here's one of the key points in looking at this picture that I realized, that the powerful logic of family reproduction runs counter to the capitalist logic of accumulation. Proving that Marx didn't drink enough wine. In 1865, just before phylloxera arrived, there were 277 grape growers in Boca alone, but not a single grower owned more than a hectare of land. A land that has become a vineyard can never be really rewilded. The forest, the return of the forest, is rather than an example of resilience, it becomes a history of human failure, of past glory, the glorious ways, and the curious ways, that generational change and inheritance law turns productive land into forest, into weeds. This land is owned, somebody owns that land, but it's beyond capitalism. As the anthropologist Anna Tsing notes, and I agree, industrial transformation turned out to be a bubble of promise, followed by lost livelihoods and damaged landscapes. And even if the intention is to smooth the transition to a new economy of enotourism, recent public rebranding of Gattinara like this as a wine destination cannot escape its ruins. This is a recently installed public art piece on the edge of the city center, and it tries to reinforce the idea of Gattinara as a wine destination for tourists. Not as a rust belt, but this choice of materials, the wine clusters poking through rusted steel inevitably evokes the empty factories that dot the area. Tourists can as well drive the nearby La Strada della Lana, the wool road, a heritage project memorializing the area's industrial history. and wine sculptures and industrial heritage forced winemakers and wine tasters into dialogue with past environmental and labor histories. That dialogue is never really about progress. Rather, it follows an organic arc, like the natural history of the vine itself. It evokes flowering, budding, fruiting, harvest, and then decay. There's an interplay between an industrial discourse about product and productivity and the wine discourse that speaks about the harmony of taste and nature. Viticulture first, then winemaking extracts nutrients from nutrients, photosynthesis, and whatever rain might actually fall. That's the physical process. There's also a labor process, and the first winemakers in this area transformed land, molding terraces out of forest floor. They hailed each falling tree as progress. In one winery, a 19th century grower marked his prosperity by commissioning this ceiling fresco, a fascinating one. And what he does is he's picturing this worker here, and you can see the wine worker is holding a chemical tank, but painted in this neo-Renaissance style. But the current winemaker explained to me that the family that commissioned this mural, that once made wine, migrated after that hailstorm, eventually reaching Los Angeles, where he opened a popular Italian restaurant. Others abandoned the fields entirely and went to work in nearby factories. By 1900, this is a heavily industrialized area, complete with factory towns, including one owned by the designer Zegna, Ermengildo Zegna, and the company town Il Centro Zegna, still there. It is a popular tourist attraction up in the hills. Maybe you visit. After the area was heavily industrialized all the way up until the 1980s, and by then the factories, in the face of international competition, began to close. This here is a view from the top of a winery, a modern winery in the very center of Gattinara, Conterno Nervi, if you know the wine. We're looking from the top of the winery to the wine hill. This is Gattinara wine hill in the front. The town of Biella, the former industrial town of Biella, is in the distance. And all we can talk about is hail. By 10 a.m. the next morning, this storm had passed through in a spectacular lightning show. But by that morning, when I visited the first winery of the day, and there were many, I have a tough job. Everyone knows who has been spared and who has been hit. The year before, marble-sized hail had slashed through this region, destroying vines from Bramatera across Gattinara to Gemme, all denominazione. Hail is localized, of course, but winemakers think about it historically. They all still talk about that devastating storm of 1905. Every winemaker explained it to me during my visit. I had visited a lot of winemakers. They also then used that 1905 cataclysm to talk about the climate future. Just half a second. The worst hit wineries in 2021 reported losses of 80 to 100% of their crops. Everyone here remembers storms like these, and they recognize that the hailstorms, like the Popilia, are more frequent and more destructive. Wine is like capital itself, to sum up, is caught between its development and its ruination. At the juncture of nature, taste, and work, thinking about ruins gives us ways of thinking about the grafts that join American rootstock to vitis vinifera, to thwart the phylloxera. It helps us think about the everyday anxieties of winemakers, about the narratives they tell enotourists and wine buyers, about the way wine laws are maintained and taste typicity is explained amidst a rapidly changing climate. So stop there.
For our next speaker on beer, Professor Jeffrey Butcher, I just wanted to announce that we're going to extend the session by about 10 minutes to 12:45, and so we'll be moving to me. 12:45? 12:45? No, just the whole session. Sorry, no, so wine and meat together. We're going to bring wine and meat together so that we can have a discussion at the end, so that our speakers here do get their 15 minutes. Yeah, no, I know that, no, it just means I don't want to cut you very short. It just means the three of you will get your full 15 minutes, and then we'll segue probably at 12 to Sean and Joseph. Yeah. So over to Professor Jeffrey Butcher, how beer became a global commodity. So for those who don't care for wine, we have beer.
Yes, this really, I think, shows the range of work that we're doing at Culinaria. So, you know, we go from fine Italian wine to cheap industrial beer. And in fact, Dan, you know, kind of is our resident, you know, gourmet chef, and I'm in charge of the tacos. So appropriate that way. So anyway, so the title has changed a little bit, as you see, but it's really just sort of explaining how beer became. So it's, as I think, travels, mobility, trade, and taste. So here is my favorite beer quote from the renowned Sicilian philosopher Francesco Zappa. You can't be a real country unless you have a beer and an airline. And here is, I think, a nice graphic depiction of that truth. And so every country has its own beer, right? So Molson Canadian, Budweiser in the United States. I don't know what is, you can't really tell some of these small ones. Maybe Moretti in Italy, but Qingdao in China, and so on and so forth. And even predominantly Muslim countries have as their wine Beck's non-alcoholic, or as it's known in the region, Mullah Light. The one exception, but the thing about it is, despite all these diverse labels, the amazing thing about this is that they're all the same beer. Okay, so it's what's called a Pilsner style beer. It's light, clear, sparkling, fizzy, and completely indistinguishable one from another. In fact, in the 1960s, marketers in the United States were trying to, you know, sort of understand, you know, and what they found is that people, consumers, had very strong feelings about their particular brand of beer, but in blind tastes could not identify it. And so how did we get to a world where we all drink the same beer? The one exception, I should say, though, you can't see it again from this small image, but Ireland is Guinness Stout, right? But in some ways, that's the exception that proves the rule. Now, this paper is about commodities, so I'll just take a moment to talk about commodities, and particularly because I'm a historian, to think about, you know, kind of how the concept of commodity changes over time, right? So it comes from the word, the Latin word commodus, which is a useful thing, but something that is bought and sold, right? So we can see the Roman markets. They're buying these goods as opposed to something that's produced at home for you know, for consumption within the household, right? And so it's a commercial thing. But over time, the meaning of commodity changes, and particularly with the rise of industrialization. And so here we can see industrial agriculture and the way that, you know, the industry tries to take organic, unwieldy, you know, living beings and turn them into standardized commodities, standardized goods that are useful for industry and all the demands of industry that want that. And so, and it's really the grain elevator that takes a big role in kind of standardizing, because you're no longer buying grain, you know, from the farmer's sack. It's all thrown together in a big bin, and it's just graded by labels. And then finally, in the kind of the post-industrial era, we've got all of these things where life itself is being commodified, turned into, things that we buy and sell. I love the idea of smart water, of branding water and selling it to, what we pour out of the tap, but selling it to us at this fine price and teaching and convincing us that we're getting something special by paying extra. And in a sense, a process of commodification, of turning, kind of sort of homemade goods into, these things that we buy and sell and that we attach all these narratives to, is what my story of beer is about. And we can see the origins of this commodification actually deep in history. I'm going to start in the early modern era, in 1516 with something called the Reinheitsgebot. Which has, it actually became kind of popular in the 1970s and 80s because of Bavaria, where this beer law, the local beer laws, the Bavarian brewers were trying to sell their beer, and they said, oh, but we have the world's oldest pure food legislation. This Reinheitsgebot. Actually, the term itself didn't come until 1919, but the law states that beer can only be made from barley, water, and hops. And they didn't know about yeast back then, but anyway. But what that meant was, and so we now think, oh, it's about purity, but in fact, it's about the control of the grain trade, but also about getting those home brewing women from selling their own home brew and ensuring that the guilds, and I've got a little guild there, a little workshop, which is growing in scale at this time, keeping these Kräuterfrauen, the little herb women, from selling these beers because they were potentially contaminated with God knows what, and using hops instead. But also just, whatever grains they had. And then they would, buy whatever was cheap, brew it and sell it. And these were considered to be very dangerous women. And you definitely wanted them back in the home and not out there selling their beers. Okay, so and in a sense, already that idea of standardizing the recipe, right, is that an early step towards the commodification of beer, right? So these different kinds of styles. Now, we have, and there are many now styles. If we go to a craft beer bar, there's this wall full of taps, and there's all these different styles. But where do styles come from? In some ways, the first industrial beer was London Porter, and it's a very dark, rich beer. And the reason was that with the early machinery in the 18th century was so primitive that only this dark beer, that the only drinkable beer had to have that rich burnt flavor, because the industry, the machinery itself imparted its own burnt flavor, and so they wanted to kind of sell it as a thing. And it takes off with the sales to London porters, right? The industrial factory and the porters obviously are the people who cart things back and forth between factories and whatnot. But and that was the market, and you see a tremendous growth in the scale of production, and with it, the adoption of new technologies. Now, at the time, there were kind of two beers, right? There was the porter, which was the working class beer, and then you had the upscale market, which was taken over by pale ale, right? So this sort of amber colored beer. And but what happened is that, it could only be made on a small scale because, you could taste those imperfections. But by the end of the 18th century, the technology had gotten so good that they could actually now mass produce the ale. And what the porter brewers discovered was actually more efficient to mass produce ale and then add in the caramel color to make it look like porter. And so they started doing that. And that in itself is kind of an interesting thing. And the idea of porter then, as the scholar, historian of science, James Sumner has argued, was in fact a marketing tool to try to sell porter to them, kind of in the face of this competition from this pale ale. Now, so that's one part of the industrial kind of creation of modern beer. The other part happens in Bavaria. And it's really using a different kind of yeast. So it's called a bottom fermenting yeast. It works in cold temperatures. I won't go all beer geek on you and get too much into it, but it's a very different kind of beer. It's a colder, purer beer, and because of the various kinds of things. And what they would do is, and again, I won't. There's a long history there, but basically it's called lager because they would put it in these underground cellars, put it on ice, and let it kind of develop slowly. But really, the industrialization, and this happens kind of over the course of the early modern era in Bavaria for various reasons. But ultimately, by the 18th century, it's become quite a well-developed system. But it's really in the 19th century when this man, Gabriel Zedelmeier, sort of industrializes it. And so he goes to Britain, learns the new industrial technology, brings it back to Munich, and creates an industrial lager. And he's trying to sort of think about how he wants this lager to be, because there's advances in the malting process, right? The creation of grain. And he decides he wants to make a dark beer. But the problem is that the Bavarian purity laws mean that he can't add the caramel that the British were doing. And so he comes up with a way of kind of coming up with this thing. And it quickly becomes all the rage across Germany, and they're exporting this stuff. And certainly once this is from about 1830, when the railroad arrives, about 1840 in Munich, they start to export it, and it really becomes a big business. But meanwhile, Zedelmeier's buddy, who also went to Britain during this time, Anton Dreyer, from Vienna brewer, creates a similar version using the Bavarian yeast, but instead uses the pale lager, right? The pale malts, pale ale malts to create Vienna lager, right? So we're already starting to see these stylistic differences, and Pilsner is just one more version of it, where it's using this very pale golden thing. Right. And so you've got kind of a spectrum of beer already by the 1850s or so, and it's intentional. I mean, I have these documents saying that these brewers were trying to kind of create this sort of a spectrum of beer that as sort of market differentiations, right? That these products were. Now, for various reasons that I won't go into, the Pilsner becomes the preferred type. And in fact, if you go to Munich today, you really have to look to get that dark beer. What you're most likely to get is a Helles, or just a light beer. And Vienna lager has just almost completely disappeared. And there's various factors involved in this industrialization creating kind of a standard beer, right? So there's giant factories. That's actually a chemical chart where they use chemical analyses. And if you ever hang out with craft brewers, they're really into their little chemical analyses. So you see all this. But there's also these giant factories using different kinds of grains. Okay. And so, I mean, it's very clear that all of these styles are actually created in the capitalist marketplace with industrialization, and with a goal to, basically selling, in these kinds of commodity markets. Okay. Now, the counterexample that everybody brings up is a Belgian beer called Lambic. Okay, and this is a spontaneously fermented, right? So they just kind of have these open air tanks, and whatever yeast crawls in there, and it's sort of seen as being this very. And so they use Peter Bruegel's, peasant paintings, and they're actually if you go to the right beer bar in Brussels, they'll actually serve you the Lambic in one of these old, earthenware jars, and you feel like you're a peasant and all that stuff. But the thing to remember is that this too is an industrial beer, and it's actually a byproduct of actually another industry that's developing in the 19th century that is selling a modern industrial product using the nostalgia of invented origins, and that is actually champagne. Right, and so winemakers like the Veuve Clicquot, right, the Widow Clicquot, were selling this champagne, and the thing about it is they were using these very large, kind of distinctively made, but non-returnable bottles. And so the Belgians were collecting the bottles, cleaning them out, and making their lambic in there. And actually, that's an advertisement from about 1900 of who the intended customer of this lambic was. You know, not your broigal peasant. It's, you know, a bourgeois out on the night, out for a night on the town. Okay, so a final kind of step in this commodification is the craft beer movement, right? You know, and here we see a popular arrogant bastard ale, right? We, you know, hop through the, you know, and then there's kind of very masculine element there where, you know, it's kind of like undrinkable stuff. But then, and then this idea, right, that it's a revolution. And so here we see, you know, you know, they've taken over the Soviet era imagery to sell beer. But in fact, when you look at craft brewers themselves, right, you know, I mean, it's a revolution in the service of markets, right? And you know, I mean, a lot of people have even argued that that's just the latest stage of capitalism, right? Is, you know, this kind of 60s era anti-capitalist marketing, and now used to you know, sell these high quality products. So there you have the commodification of beer. Thank you.
Thanks to Jeffrey, and you can actually read Jeffrey's forthcoming Imperial Hops.
No, it's actually, that's not the title.
Oh, okay. We'll change title in Global Food History sometime next year.
No, that article. No,
Yeah.
that article doesn't have. Yeah, I thought you were talking about the book. That's
Yeah,
not the title of the book.
No, the book is called something else. There'll be a book release which Culinary advertised. We're now going next to Professor Alison Smith.
Okay, somebody else can have to
Came
turn
with
this
the
on.
program because amongst the many responsibilities that many hats we all wear, Alison also happens to be the chair of the history department, and I believe has chairing meeting.
Not until noon, but.
Yes, exactly. So that way you don't have to rush.
Sure.
And we're going to have Australian wines after drunkenness. I also wanted to point out that some of you heard Jackson Go's wonderful presentation yesterday based on his PhD. And Jackson is actually going to be starting a postdoc project under Alison's supervision, which is one of the wonderful ways we love to train and mentor our young people.
Actually, I could show one picture really quickly. Let me just show one thing. Up here. I was going to do that, but I think I can do this.
Should work.
There we go. So I have to bring us down a little bit. Maybe it's because I'm a Russian historian, which at the moment is particularly a thing that brings everybody down, but there we go. So I am a historian who's looked at the history of food in Imperial Russia, and also a lot of sort of non-food related social history as well, which may be that one of the things that sort of pushed me toward thinking about not a specific commodity, but the act of drunkenness, the sort of effect of certain alcoholic things is because of my social historian inclinations. But it may also be because the alcoholic beverage most associated with Russia is, of course, vodka. And it's like people claim that you can have like fancy vodka, but really it's about getting drunk. And that is at the base of it. It is a thing for celebrations. It's not really a thing that's savored. It is the thing that makes you drunk. And I think that's part of it. This is a poster from the late 19th century, and it says, "Drunkenness is the root of all evil," with this big green snake distillery in the center. People are pouring in grain. They're getting out spouts of vodka. And then around the edges, you see people going to jail. You see families disrupted. You see fights in bars. You see domestic violence. You see begging. You see pickpocketing. You see a devil serving, but that's something. What else do we have here? We have murder, we have death, we have suicide in multiple forms, and more begging. So like this idea that alcohol is this huge disruptive force is the thing that really comes up when you're doing sort of drink history from the point of view of Russia. There's a bit of other stuff, of course. Let me just take this off because that's one image I wanted to show. You know, I started thinking about this a couple of years ago, and it's actually because of Twitter. I've been doing work on a particular sort of microhistory of a particular palace in town just outside St. Petersburg. And in the records, I've been reading lots of police records. There were some army people, soldiers, that's what they're called, stationed in the area. So I was looking at court-martial records for this particular army regiment, just all sorts of things. And shockingly enough, drunkenness pops up in a lot of these things. And I was tweeting a couple of these moments, and a colleague tweeted back, "That's real life drunk history," because there's a TV show called Drunk History, all of this. And I thought, haha. So I started actually teaching a class called Drunk History to think not just about alcohol as a commodity, which isn't, I think, a very important topic for all of the reasons that we've heard, but also about the sort of social effects of alcohol and what this means in society. It's been a really interesting class to teach, and I'm sort of looking forward to teaching it more. And then it also got me thinking about writing something about this within my own research. So 2 summers ago, I think, I thought like, oh, I just need to find a little, because I'm department chair, I was like, I need to find a little thing that will be a quick thing to write. So I started going through all my notes and looking for all of the references to drunkenness. And it turned out that I had pages upon pages of references to drunkenness. And then I thought, well, I should look at how this shows up in legal sources. Also, with COVID, there was not travel right now. Who knows if I'll ever go back to Russia again. So thinking through printed legal sources and stuff like that. Classic way to spend time. I looked for drunkenness there. Again, probably 100 pages of notes on just this topic. And so this made me think, well, maybe there is more than just a simple little article about this. So I've been sort of teasing things out. I've got a couple of articles that are either out or on their way out already. And it's really made me think a lot about the specific role of drunkenness within Russian history, and in some ways, I think more generally as well. As I've looked at this, I think it requires grappling with a couple of things. And one is that basic idea that Russians are particularly inclined to drunkenness, which is a thing that I think a lot of people believe. There's a lot of people who make that case, go back to one of the very first written sources about the modern, about Rus, which is not exactly Russia. It is the origin state that leads eventually to Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and that's a whole political thing right now, but there we go. There's a tale of the Christianization of the Rus lands, in which Grand Prince Vladimir, who becomes sainted as the one who brings orthodoxy to the Rus people, he has to decide on what religion would be right for his people. He sends out emissaries who look at the Roman Church, except they go to the Germanies to look at that. They look at Islam, they go to Bulgaria, or Bulgar for that, which is the Bulgar lands. And then they look at the Eastern Church, Eastern Christian Church, where they go to actually Constantinople itself. So Germany versus, they think Constantinople is the most amazing thing they've ever seen and choose orthodoxy. But one of the versions of that story says that one of the reasons they do not choose Islam is that abstinence from pork and wine were disagreeable to them. And Vladimir is said to have said, "Drinking," said he, "is the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure." So this sort of classic story. Now the drinking at that time is wine, it's beer, it's mead. It's not vodka. Vodka doesn't come into the story until the late 1500s, probably. Sometime in the 1500s. There's the exact date's still a little bit difficult to think. It's definitely in place by the end of the 1500s into the 1600s. And a bunch of European travelers who went to the Russian lands, at that point called Muscovy, were frequently astonished by the scenes of drunkenness that they saw them. So one in the 17th century named Adam Oliarius said, "There's no place in the world where drunkenness is more common than in Muscovy. All conditions, ecclesiastics and laics, men and women, old and young, will drink strong water at any time, before, at, and after their meals," and relates all sorts of quite disturbing accounts of violence on drunkenness. And these accounts were very persuasive, sort of kept being brought back in the 19th century by people who were worried about drunkenness there, saying we've got this sort of perpetual problem. So this sort of idea of anecdotes of drunkenness was just a huge part of the way of thinking about things. Now that said, I think there's also a fair bit of evidence that Russia's drinking practices like this were a bit less ingrained or outrageous than they indicated, particularly if viewed comparatively. Even if we go back to those early Rus states, it's very clear that Rus were simply one of the many peoples who drank. There are all sorts of accounts of moderation in drinking just as much as there are accounts of drunkenness and things like that. So there's a whole range of practices then. I think the travel narratives are also a bit less damning than they first appear. By the end of the 18th century, travel accounts, and I've read a lot of them, go much less into story, like drunkenness does not appear in them very much. And I think part of the reason is that gin has appeared and other sorts of spirited beverage, distilled beverages have appeared more commonly in Europe, making scenes of, like, what basically once you've seen Gin Lane, vodka doesn't seem that shocking or anything like that. So this sort of sense that this is a comparison, distilled spirits came to the Russian lands first and therefore shocked everybody, but once those kinds of beverages spread elsewhere, it was there. You also get all sorts of things. At the end of the 17th century, the Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich was at one point, this is a great quote, he complained to the King of England that the British ambassador was causing disturbances because his servants, being drunk, did very often affront and abuse the emperor's subjects. And then Peter the Great himself, who was definitely a man who knew how to drink, there are accounts of him drinking, like not getting that drunk because he only had one bottle of wine and things like that. But he is said to have actually learned his drinking among the foreign residents of Moscow. Like, so this sort of sense, it was in the foreign quarter that he learns all this stuff. So I think that there are these ways in which this sort of specific thing gets placed on Russia in a way that is not, it's not that it's not accurate, but it's also not complete. Of course, there is still a lot of drinking and a lot of drunkenness, and like there's no way to say that there is not. It's simply more that it should be placed in a comparative context in a lot of ways. So thinking about where drunkenness shows up, especially as we get into, say, the 19th century, there is a perpetual tension that comes in within Russian policy and thinking about vodka in particular. And I should note, I'm saying vodka, it's not exactly the word that was usually used at the time, but it's essentially a distilled spirit, distilled from rye, that was heavily intoxicating. The issue is that the imperial state, or first the Muscovite state and then the imperial state, in various ways saw this kind of drinking as a way to earn money. Alcohol taxes, excise taxes, tax farming, monopolies on vodka, the exact mechanism changed over time. But at the end of the 18th century, about a third of the state income of the Russian Empire came from vodka. Yeah. It declined a bit in the 19th century, not by all that much. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was probably more around like 25%, something like that, but still a huge amount. And I wish I had this easily accessible to show it. There's an amazing moment at the beginning of the First World War when Nicholas II proclaims prohibition within Russia, which nobody really talks about, but there was a period, there had been various moves toward this prohibition, but that meant that at the time of the First World War, the Russian imperial state cut off 20% of its income because of instituting prohibition. So like there's all of these ways that it creates like huge problems in various ways. So perpetually, there is a recognition that it's impossible to eliminate drinking until this sort of surprising moment in the First World War. But at the same time, there is so much recognition that this brings problems. There is concern in laws, in journalistic accounts, starting in the 18th century, really growing strong at the end of the 19th century about poverty, particularly peasant poverty. There is a fear that alcohol is pulling money out of the peasants' hands and that this is causing huge problems there. There is also concern that this is unevenly felt in ways that have imperial dimensions, particularly imperial dimensions that involve Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia today. Those regions had very different historic sales systems, and all sorts of things were read into that as part of the way this happens. There are also paternalistic efforts to keep alcohol away from the indigenous people of Siberia in ways that echo an awful lot of what people in Canada may well be familiar with. So there's all of these ways that alcohol policy plays into other sorts of concerns about poverty and disorder. Disorder is the other big thing that shows up. And I got an article that came out online in the journal Russian Review on the specific question of drunkenness and disorder in the Imperial Army. It's open access, so have at it. Based on the fact that it's like, I looked at a whole bunch of court-martials and all but like 2 of them involve drunkenness. And it makes people sass their commanders, it makes people steal things, it leads to violence, and it appears to lead to self-harm as well. And all of these issues play out. I had this one thing in the military, but also much more broadly. Drunkenness was understood to be both a problem when it was excessive or in particularly problematic, like not in church, that was not good. So in particular places or too much, and as something that exacerbated other sorts of, or led to other sorts of disorder, particularly disorders of word, of violence, of theft, and of self-harm. And all of these things are things that are sort of central to this huge concern that leads also into thinking about degeneration theory and a lot of other issues at the end of the 20th century, or at the end of it, well, actually, yes, in the 20th century. I could tell a whole story about the 20th century in which the life expectancy for men and women in late 20th century Russia is the widest ever recorded because women live so much longer. And the assumption is vodka is mostly to blame for this, that men die faster or younger due to vodka. It's a perpetual problem that sort of has a lot of sort of contemporary resonances, but that also was something that really played out in a lot of other ways. So I'll pause there, but I could talk about many more things if there's questions.
Over to our visitor from Australia, who is a Fulbright scholar at Mercy Davis this year with the wonderful wine archives there. And so we're now going to go to the other side of the world. Just a quick point here, at this very moment, we have 2 courses being taught at UTSC, which we will repeat every year, Eating and Drinking Across Americas, where we had the wonderful Indigenous Days experience last year. We also have Eating and Drinking Across Global Asia, which Jackson is teaching at this very moment. At BIC, of course, we have the wonderful wine course, which will continue. There is the exhibit right outside. I also wanted to point out that thanks to BIC's wonderful student body, Culinaria intern, Cheryl Young, is currently doing a fully funded master's at Oxford. She was a MyTax fellow with the City of Toronto and Culinaria Feeding City last year. And we also have Emma Wong, who graduated from the DHR wine class and is currently working at Dilo, one of Toronto's premier fine dining restaurants, and working to support our City of Toronto food innovation and learning space with Pete Scarborough. Over to Julie and the exciting world of wine history from Australia, but the really, really important, we talked about Indigenous histories from North and South Americas yesterday, and today we're going to look at some of the Indigenous colonial histories from Australia. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks so much, Chair. And it's terrific to be here. It's very exciting to visit. Thank you to Jeffrey and Dan for hosting me. I've really enjoyed meeting everybody. I start teaching a course called Food and Drinks in Global History at my university next semester. So this is the perfect preparation. It's just extraordinary. And I also said my body of work is about the role of wine growing in Australian society and culture, and extends more broadly. So I've been working on these kinds of topics since my PhD, and I'm now a mid-career researcher. So this is a part of ongoing work. So what I'm going to talk about intersects with an existing publication. I'm kind of opening that out a little bit further as well. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm a non-Indigenous historian and that I usually live and work on the Wabakal country in Eastern Australia. And those are lands that were taken through colonisation without treaty or compensation. And I acknowledge too, and I hope I'm correct about this, that I'm visiting the traditional ancestral lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit.
Yes, we do.
Great. So this paper's position in relation to Indigenous settler reconciliation in Australia, a formal policy of the Australian government since 1991. Histories of Indigenous settler relations in Australia are focused on what brings First Nations peoples and settler colonial peoples together and what still keeps them apart. Aboriginal people have historically been labourers in particular sectors of the Australian economy. Historically, racialisation of Aboriginal people in colonial discourse arose from a perception by colonists that Aboriginal people were unwilling to conform to being contented labourers. Instead, Aboriginal people who survived frontier violence and the introduction of European diseases persisted with their traditional modes of managing nature, such as food production. This is known in Australia as caring for country through attention to seasonal life cycles and protocols for hunting and gathering, as well as fire farming, or what we now call cultural burning, that kept more than human nature in balance. I'm just going to pause for a second and say, I'm possibly crashing across morning tea, so I will not be remotely offended if you need to get tea or coffee or food, because that's what I would have to do right now. So please don't feel you have to just sit and watch. So in reconnecting Indigenous histories and settler colonial wine growing in Australia, it's mission stations and reserves that serve as a connective process, but only at a few places and in a particular time frame. So some scene setting is required. This is the official map of Australia's Indigenous clans and language groups. Of course, demarcating geographies in this way is a Western European knowledge practice of possessive control. Even so, we do need a kind of touchstone to be able to understand how to give an acknowledgement of country and how it is that we respect First Nations. So also I show you this map because this is the island continent, and Tasmania, it was half of Tasmania is down there. And so we talk about all of these First Nations as Aboriginal people. That's still a reasonably respectful word to use. Aborigines is not respectful anymore. It does pop up in my paper for historical reasons. But also when I'm talking about Aboriginal people, that means that I'm just talking about people from, and I'll show you which particular parts of Australia, because Torres Strait Islanders are also Indigenous Australians, but in terms of the location and climate of Torres Strait Island, the Torres Strait Islands, there's no wine growing there. So that's I'm just letting you know that I'm using the most respectful language I possibly can. I am from the Wabakal country, which is here. I'm going to be talking about New Norcia, which is over here on your country, and I'm going to be talking about Corranderk, which is here on Kurnai country, and Sackville Reach, which is here in Darug lands, to give you some orientation. So also, this is the contemporary wine regions of Australia. So you see, it's an industry that really clusters around the south of the island continent. This really here is a touristic industry. Growing wine grapes there is for tourists essentially, and this also does encompass areas that I'm talking about historically. I also just point out that these are some of the key settler colonial wine growing countries in the world. And this shows you proportionally, in terms of the contemporary economies, what it is that wine production represents as a part of the industry. And you can see this is Australia. So it's quite a small industry in Australia. I want to be clear about that, compared to New Zealand, with Australians inevitably compare themselves to New Zealand, hoping, of course, that there'll be a feeling of superiority, and there isn't always. But this gives you a sense of the proportional representation of the industry. So wine grape cultivation is a relatively small part of the Australian agricultural economy. So my point is, it's not significant in the political economy of settler colonisation, but I very much argue in my work that it's integral to settler colonialism as an ideology of replacing Indigenous ancestral land management with market-based viticulture. Because viticulture, wine growing, particularly for making wine, is perceived as a higher order or civilized form of cultivation. That was certainly the case in the 19th century. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to this map while I'm talking about something else. So grape wine, as you know, is made by fermenting the fruit of the deciduous wine grapevine species Vitis vinifera. Vinifera is not a native species in Australia. So unlike the Americas, which has a native Vitis species, the Oceanic region has no Vitis. So it's an introduced plant species in Australia. It's not invasive though. I did check. Has it ever run away? No. And that's important to consider because there are plant species in Australia that have contributed to ecological problems. So in this paper, I'm interested in the involvement of Indigenous people in wine growing and wine consumption in Australia because Australia is a settler colonial nation with contested racial belonging. Wine has many cultural meanings as a result of its diversity of production. Within the French culture of fine dining and gastronomy that came to be very admired in Britain and North America, as well as in Australia, wine means refinement, civility, authority, and social status. Wine grape cultivation requires very settled conditions to achieve fine wines. Vineyards must be established and nurtured in places where the types of grapes and styles of wine made from those grapes achieve a particular sensory quality. It doesn't have to be the finest wine, but it's fascinating to work on wine history in Australia and see the experimentation that occurred over time. And of course, knowledge of fine wines has also historically been a source of cultural capital in Western societies. And in Australia, that really emerged as a culture in the 1980s. Knowing about quality fine wines as well as enjoying them is considered in circles of privilege to be akin to understanding fine art, architecture, or literature. And this may seem, of course that's so, but I say this because I also study the massification of wine, which is the democratization of wine culture. So I like to place these ideas side by side. So wine growing in Australia in the period I'm discussing was mainly an Anglo pursuit, as wine growing required capital in the 19th century to be established. So it was really only Anglo colonists in the 19th century who had capital. There are a couple of other European diasporas that had access to this type of cultivation, but because it requires a high level of investment, rather than in European traditional winelands and the folk culture of wine growing up from small parcels of production and so on. So it's quite different in Australia. So although Aboriginal Australians have traditional psychotropics, there's not an equivalent for manufactured alcohol in traditional Aboriginal societies. And therefore, there are no cultural narratives or taboos around alcohol overconsumption. So the violence and dispossession of colonisation has prevented Indigenous Australians also from having the same opportunities as non-Indigenous Australians to own land or make a living from it, but also to enjoy the fruits of the land in a way they're choosing. Some Aboriginal Australians have historically participated in vineyard labour, as I'm going to talk about, but Aboriginal people have not participated in the making and selling of wine, and certainly not in a culture of fine wine, as opposed to consuming alcohol only for its psychotropic effects. Moreover, the absence of Aboriginal people from aspects of wine culture associated with good life or a high life of ease and refinement in choice in access to leisure points to the opening up and the continuance of a divide between what it means to be Indigenous or non-Indigenous in Australia. And the advance of the colonial frontier in Australia, about which there is a vast literature, was accompanied by allocation of reserve lands to Aboriginal people and to organisations such as Christian missions that manage the development of housing and agriculture on some of those reserve lands. Usually, Aboriginal reserve lands were the most unsuitable areas for agriculture. Now, I know there's going to be some mapping onto other histories that you're familiar with. I would just say really quickly that there is a difference between, as I understand it, the Canadian reserve lands allocation and the possibility of capital accumulation from that land is different in Australia. There just hasn't been that same kind of opportunity for Aboriginal people. So I'm going to consider 3 case studies briefly. I'm going to first talk about New Milcea Aboriginal Mission Station, which was established in the colony of Western Australia in 1859 by Spanish Catholic missionary Rosendo Salvado, who pursued a calling to leave Europe and work with godless people. He seems like he was a nice bloke, actually. So, and I mean, mission, we have a history, as does everyone, of some pretty heinous missionaries. So Salvado actually seems like he was genuinely a very benevolent man. And he apparently came from a wealthy family, and this was his vocation, was to go somewhere very out of the way, and he certainly achieved that. So he began with 20 acres of inland land in the area where he established an Aboriginal mission. And over 40 years, he built a property through lease and purchase that was 950,000 acres, mainly of marginal sheep grazing land. And the reason that he was able to keep this mission was that the land was so poor for agriculture that this wonderful monastery I'll tell you about managed to turn it into quite a successful farmland. But it was such poor land that he stated, in fact, he knew it was unlikely to be taken from him, which was the usual practice that happened in the colonial Australian situation. Aboriginal people would get some land, probably not under their control, but they were participating in working with those reserve lands, in attempting to be a part of an agricultural economy, but then those lands would be taken away and given to white farmers. So this happened over a period of time. But what Salvador did was I think he retrospectively applied his wisdom about it, but he chose a place that actually white farmers didn't want. So he was able to keep this enterprise going up until his death around the turn of the 20th century. So at its height, New Norcia had about 80 brothers who trained Aboriginal people in farming and other manual work, as well as educating Aboriginal children in reading, writing and music. And this is not Salvador, but two other brothers and a musical performance with a group of Aboriginal children. So Aboriginal children were at their toddlerhood. Okay, thank you, Joe. At their toddlerhood, they were separated from their families but remained on the property, and there were girls and boys' schools. So this is still not an idyllic situation. There's still the separation of mixed descent children from their families, but there's a sense of community, and New Norcia grows into a highly functioning village where there's an Aboriginal postmistress and there's a village of Aboriginal people quite close to the monastery as well. Now, what is interesting to me about New Norcia is that it had, for the time, quite extensive vineyards. They grew to be about 80 acres, and the monks would cultivate a small black grape. I suspect it was Shiraz, but that hasn't been exactly where I've been focusing my interest, so I usually do ask these kinds of questions about cultivars as well. But apparently, the monks made a very delicate wine. They had extensive cellars. But what is interesting to me is that there were so many elements of a settler colonial social and economic way of life that were taught to Aboriginal people and into which Aboriginal people were integrated at this site. And yet I can find absolutely no evidence that Aboriginal people either worked in the vineyards or were trained in the vineyards or worked in the cellars or drank the wine. So they were not permitted to drink the wine at this point in history in any of the Australian colonies. Aboriginal people were not permitted to drink alcohol. And there was a sense of a mission was highly successful if it did manage to have a completely sober Aboriginal community. So this is a place where it's speaking about an absence, not a presence, but it's important nonetheless because of the other two case studies. So this is Corandurk. In the colony of Victoria in the 1860s, Corandurk Aboriginal Station was also established as a European-style farm with a settler manager who at first was the first settler manager was quite an ally of the Kulin people, and then also cooperative Aboriginal labour was applied on this land, and it was suitable for agriculture. So there'd been quite a clever selection of this particular land. Corandurk served as a haven for the wider clans of the Kulin Confederacy, which is the Yorta Yorta, Gunai Kunai, and the Barappa. Corandurk had no wine grapes, but its several successful crops produced by Aboriginal people included commercial hops. And the hops you can see in the image on the right-hand side. On the left is an etching of the Aboriginal village at Corandurk. So the hops were sold in Melbourne, and they were very famous. They won prizes, and it was one of the ways that the mission station was able to be self-supporting. But in 1881, colonial authorities conducted an inquiry and refused to permit the Aboriginal people on this property to have any kind of permanent ownership. So this is a big thing. You cannot, if you're an Aboriginal person so mixed descent or not, in Australia, you cannot own land in freehold until the 1980s. Yeah. So so this is, at this stage, there's still the control of the land by a board, but over time, Corranderk was then also taken for white farmers. But the reason that I'm talking about it is that it was neighbouring a very famous settler colonial vineyard and winery owned by a Swiss family. And the reason this comes up in my work is that on the right is a picture of William Barak, who was he's a Kulin man who's a leader of the Corranderk community. And he stays living at Corranderk, which is known by the Dupuri family as, and everyone in the district, as the Blacks Station. Barak is one of our most famous Aboriginal artists, particularly from this period. And this is a painting that he painted of the Dupuri's vineyard that is quite close to Corranderk. And you can see we've got 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk faster. You can see the lines of the vineyard and these absolutely astonishingly beautiful eucalypts with their deep roots into the ground. And if you are interested in knowing more about this, there's an article where we talk about what's written at the bottom of the painting and so on. So this is a symbol of an ongoing labour relationship between the Black Station and the Dupuris, and this is a diary, an agricultural daybook entry. This is the kind of source material I've worked with quite a lot. I just highlighted where this day that Victor Dupuri went to the Black Station and got 16 blacks, to quote directly, to come and do seasonal work. So there becomes a kind of mutual dependency. We can see in the records that there's money loaned to some of the people from Corranderk, including William Barak. This kind of consonance that exists that we see here is rare. There is only one other instance of this that I found, and this is relating to a vineyard and winery owned by an Italian man called Thomas Fiaschi in New South Wales. His property was Titsana. It was established in the 1880s. Sackville Reach is an Aboriginal reserve established not far from Titsana. So it's in a farming district in the 1890s. And particularly at the turn of the century, Sackville Reach's Aboriginal people were portrayed as an idyllic group of labourers. And we talk about this in the same article I just mentioned that's published in Global Food History. Some colleagues and I talk about how there's a sense of these people having been deeply civilized. There's some very beautiful rhapsodic prose about how beautiful they are and how civilized they are and how sober they are. Essentially, they are depending, however, on labour, on vineyards, including the vineyards of Titsana, the Italian Thomas Fiaschi. And I just want to also point to the fact that work around frontier violence has established, of course, that the land that this photograph was taken on, for example, was not willingly or easily relinquished by its first peoples. And historian John Connor called settler aggression to obtain land such as this particular portion under colonial rule as open war and terror for Aboriginal locals in the years of pacification, which was the settler discursive way of hiding the idea of frontier violence, between 1795 and 1827. So it's about 90 years after that period. So in conclusion, these three case studies show that for the most part, consonant relations existed between Aboriginal people, and this is significant, some non-Anglo colonists entangled in various ways with wine growing. So I don't have any evidence of these kinds of relationships between Aboriginal people and Anglo wine growing enterprises. So I find that really fascinating culturally. But this consonance of sorts was not to last. The system of protection of Aboriginal people became more restrictive from the 1910s, and I haven't found any similar case studies beyond that period. So Aboriginal people this is my final 2 or 3 sentences. Aboriginal people began to have access to collective land ownership from the 70s and the 80s. And I would just finish as a kind of coda by pointing out that there has been one wine grape vineyard on Aboriginal land, so collectively owned land council Aboriginal land from 1998 to 2008 on the Murrin Bridge Aboriginal Reserve at Lake Jellicoe in central western New South Wales. Murrin Bridge wines were made by an Italian winemaker in the Riverina region from the grapes grown on that land. But that project, and an anthropologist has studied this mission station, a reserve, quite closely, and that project was, that wasn't particularly meaningful for Aboriginal people, but there are 2 new Aboriginal wine brands in the last 2 years. And these brands have really started to establish the idea of a connection between Indigenous people and wine growing. And thank you for indulging me that possibly a couple of extra minutes.
About Munda, because that is one of the indigenous groups from central India that.
Of course, that's really fascinating.
So thank you for a really amazing set of papers. So we have a democratic process we can have now. Thanks to my ruthless chewing of our speakers. Apologize for that. We do have, but I wanted to make sure people were able to hear each other's words. So we can take 5 minutes, to get tea and coffee and washroom break. But I wanted to ask everyone, because I know a couple of people have to go. And
Working?
That's the last slide.
Do we need this? Oh, the other one?
It needs to be.
Oh, okay. Here, 1 second. This one? No? Okay, hold on.
I should just point out that, like yesterday, we do have participants on the Zoom call from different parts of the world. When we go for the discussion, we try to incorporate them. Something will remind me.
It's got the same.
Okay, can you move through?
I can, great, all right. I will not go through the larger context because it's the same as what Jose said. I will say a little bit more just about the survey. It's a nationally representative survey on six major demographic dimensions. This is a food symposium, so we won't talk about methods, but I'm going to present some more of the survey results compared to the focus groups. It's a legitimate point, what do these surveys results actually tell us, especially given the problems with sampling and with the superficiality of survey responses. But let's just bracket that for now and talk about the food element of it. Okay, so I'll start by saying that Chapter 9, why Chapter 3 and Chapter 9? I don't know. But there's always other chapters in between. So we're just giving you small snippets from the larger project. This chapter is called Other People's Meat, and it is rooted in a couple of insights or foundational kinds of assumptions within sociology. So the first one I'll describe from sociology of consumption. The insight is that what we consume is related to how we see ourselves and the ways that others see us. And this understanding is applied to consumption of all kinds, but so everything we buy and that we use, but it's perhaps even more clearly evident in the case of consumption as eating. So we're saying consumption but in the broadest sense of the term, but also in terms of actually eating. And another foundational insight in this chapter is the relationship between concepts of social boundaries and symbolic boundaries. So social boundaries are the divisions within society in terms of people's lives. who they're friends with, who they know personally, who they marry, who they work with, who they communicate with, who they live near, whose lifestyles are similar. So these are actual demographic sort of divides within society in terms of lived experiences. So we know that there are lots of different kinds of social boundaries. Symbolic boundaries are our understandings and perceptions of different kinds of people. So who we think we are similar to or different from. And these symbolic boundaries can also be evaluative. So we use them to describe different kinds of people, but we also use them to evaluate people. So placing people up or down in a hierarchy of status or worthiness. And so we see that there's a relationship between symbolic boundaries and social boundaries, but they're not the same thing. But symbolic boundaries, what we think about people, can affect who we actually end up connecting with and having ties to and having these actual associations with, not just perceptions of. And at the same time, clearly consumption behaviors contribute to how we draw symbolic boundaries, right? Because we think we know a lot about people based on how they can consume, which then feeds into our perceptions of who they are and what they're worth. Okay, so those are the foundational assumptions that we're going to be applying to meat. So whereas Jose was talking a lot about the 4 N's and whether or not people eat meat, here we're looking specifically at the different kinds of meat that people eat. So in the same way that Jeffrey found that people attach different narratives to different kinds of beers, people attach different kinds of narratives to different kinds of meat. So there's different understandings of the meanings of different kinds of meat that can be related to symbolic boundaries. So we asked our focus group participants and our survey respondents a range of different questions, not only about what they ate, but also about their perceptions about different kinds of meat. And in asking them about their consumption habits and their likes and dislikes, we saw some patterns in the ways that they talked about different kinds of meat that were also related to their perceptions of the people who ate those kinds of meat. And so what emerged in our data were perceptions of, so we're going to just talk about the 3 most sort of dominant patterns that emerged around cheap meat, happy meat, and weird meat. And so I'll describe what each of those means. And just to be clear, we're talking about perceptions of our respondents and interviewees, not about meat that can be objectively labeled as cheap, happy, or weird, right? These are social constructions of different kinds of meat. All right, so to begin with cheap meat, what does that mean? Well, perceptions of cheap meat were that it was produced only through the conventional meat industry. And it was perceived to come from predominantly poorly treated animals who might even have been sick. And the overall ethos of the production of cheap meat is to produce the maximum quantity for the minimum price. So accordingly, for cheap meat, quality is generally lacking, and the standards for animal welfare are assumed to be low. Some people were grossed out. So as we heard, this is the kind of meat that often a lot of people found gross. It was suspiciously cheap, right? It could be disgusting for that reason. So that's what cheap meat is in terms of perceptions. So from our survey data, we had a question on who eats what kinds of different kinds of meat. So we had a lot more questions here. So I'm just showing you kind of the extremes. So we asked a question, who eats this? And so we had these kinds of meat here. And the pattern that we see here helps us to actually accept the view that people really do draw symbolic boundaries according to meat consumption. So these are their perceptions of elite people and low status people, and in terms of what they eat. So you can see the hot dogs, the percent of respondents who agreed that elite people eat hot dogs was only 3.4% of respondents, but 67.7% of respondents agreed that low status people eat hot dogs. So ground beef is a very similar type of pattern, and then it kind of flips so that people perceive elite people as eating foie gras and oysters, but low status people do not eat foie gras and oysters. So if you look at our data and data from other studies, we can see that these perceptions don't really match up with reality. Basically, everybody eats ground beef, right? Like that's, and even in our own survey, we asked people about their consumption habits, and the people with the highest amounts of education and income, they're eating a lot of ground beef, and only a minority of them are eating foie gras, right? Like, so foie gras is actually not predominantly eaten by most elite people because so few people eat it at all. But so you can see how people are drawing these boundaries that are narratives rather than actual observations. But it's also clearly about who cheap meat is for, right? So cheap meat is for people without the resources to afford the non-cheap meat. So what do they think about these people? So some people, there's different perspectives that were offered. So some people offered a perspective of you are what you eat, and it was kind of judging, right? Like, so if you're going to go and spend, your budget on cheap meat, which is low quality suspect, meat, it indicates that you're uncaring about food and making poor choices. But at the same time, a lot of people realized that it wasn't so much a choice. There was some sympathy for the people who were eating cheap meat because there was a recognition that, yeah, they're feeding their families, they eat the protein. So one of the focus group responded, I picture a parent with 3 kids running around that just cannot handle anything else. They're filled to the brim, So there was a lot of understanding that for a lot of people, this was the meat that was available to them, especially for feeding families. So sometimes cheap meat eaters were held to account for the poor choices, and sometimes they were forgiven for not having more options that were realistically open to them. Okay, happy meat. So one thing I'll note is that these pictures are of the living animals, right? So it's a lot easier to talk about happy meat when you're seeing the animals when they actually are happy. And so they're not just alive, but they're outside. They're not crowded. The weather is nice. They're clearly they're living the good life for animals. So what do we mean by happy meat? Often perceived as healthier and more ethical as a product. So its consumers are likewise healthier and more ethical as people often. So from our survey data, 6% of people labeled meat eaters, just as in general, as moral people, but they labeled 38% of happy meat eaters as moral people. So you can see that you get a big boost in terms of how frequently people see you as moral if you're eating happy meat versus conventional meat. 4% of our respondents labeled meat eaters as politically active, although you could make the argument that meat eating right now is an incredibly political act. But 28% saw happy meat eaters as politically active. And 36% of our survey respondents agreed that good people make it a priority to buy ethical meat, while only 19% of respondents disagreed with that statement. So you can see there's some clear boundary drawing there around happy meat. And who are these people? Well, they can be elite, ethical foodies. And so in some of our other research, actually, no, we published from this survey data with this as well. The people who have the most highest incomes and most education, the food that they value or that they prefer the most are foods that are both aesthetically and morally consecrated. So aesthetically meaning that it's what foodies say tastes the best, it's the best quality food, but also is food that has moral stamps of approval or ethical stamps of approval. So think there, like organic certification. So at the same time, there's also a broad recognition of unaffordability and lack of supply. People were sometimes recognize that not everyone can access happy meat, but there was also among some respondents an expectation that people should choose better and that they could choose better, but they weren't. Okay, and last, weird meat. What does weird meat mean? So clearly, like just the same with cheap and happy, but it's probably clearer with weird. This is a positional statement. Weird meat is weird when it is perceived to be rare and it negatively evaluated. So it can be negatively evaluated because the meat is gross, or it can be foreign, or it can be nonsensical or ill-conceived, or some combination of these qualities. So it's rather unusual, but it's also bad. This kind of is where we get the title from, like other people's meat for this chapter. So there's a lot of thinking about weird meat cross-culturally, right? Because things that are very unusual to us that we're not familiar with, that we didn't grow up with, but that also might come from an animal that we would not eat, or a part of an animal that we would not eat. Those are the kinds of meat that we often think of as weird. And we saw people saying these kinds of things, but there was also a lot of hesitancy because we live in an era now where we recognize that kind of evaluative statement can be offensive, right? It really reveals more about you and your own limitations than it does about somebody else doing something wrong. But we can definitely point to some of that in our data. But one interesting trend that was particularly clear in the survey data was around weirdness and gender for meat, right? So this really shows how it's positional. So, and one of our questions, I don't have the results here, but was a question of, it's weird when men don't eat meat. And then we also asked, it's weird, do you agree that it's weird when women don't eat meat? And much more, almost twice as many people agree that it's weird when men don't eat meat and when women don't eat meat. And in these findings, we asked the people, they themselves, how would you personally feel about eating this? And so these are meats that seemed like they could potentially be weird to us. And one thing that's first clear is that it's not just gender going on, because most men and most women find eating horse, the idea of eating horse, uncomfortable. But at the same time, there's still a clearly gendered pattern here where women more frequently are uncomfortable with eating horse, with eating organ meats, with eating game, even veal and lamb, which some people don't think of as weird at all, right? But still, there's that's a perspective. And clearly more women are weirded out by the idea of eating those kinds of meat. So we can see here, it's not like the only thing going on is that there's a gendered symbolic boundary, but meat is a particularly clear example where people are drawing symbolic boundaries that are on the basis of gender. And I'll stop there.
We had a whole horse discussion at dinner last.
Oh, really?
Joel, do you mind bringing up the Zoom room? I think we should say hello to our Zoom participants. So thank you, Jeffrey, for your very efficient sharing. You, by moral authority, you
No, they just were very proud.
They were just very prompt and efficient as they are. But thank you to all our speakers on Drink and Meat for being wonderfully cooperative, insightful, and nice. So can I ask for questions directed to Drink first and then to Meat? I see Noah. Oh, yes.
Sorry, behind you.
Yes, sorry. I also want to say hello to our Zoom participants. And I will point out, we have our lovely Culinaria grad student, Lisa. We have Rafi Groslik, who I don't know, but who has written on organic foods all the way from Israel. I believe I saw Andrea Morias from our collaborators at the Center for Food Security at TMU. We also have Sarah Elton from TMU right here. And I see a couple of other people who were gracious enough to join yesterday. Thank you all. And we will be sharing the recordings with our friends at Bologna and also via the University of Milan, the Quarter-Baked Culinary Forum, ASFS and CAPS. And if you want the recording sent to any other network, just let us know. So over to questions, both from the Zoom room and from the room here. I think Noah, then Janita, and on the Zoom call, just, I guess,
Raise their hand.
raise your hands. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Noah Allison. I'm a associate fellow at the Global Research Center. My question is for Dan. And Dan, I was really struck by your observation when you were showing I believe, the abandoned factory in the forest, and you talked about the distinction and the observation of Marxism's limited critique on life making. And I was wondering if you're planning on unpacking that kind of paradox together, eating and drinking as a form of life making, a form of social reproduction, and how that fits into capitalism.
Yeah, I think it was one of the really fascinating things that I saw everywhere in wine regions, right? Because it is agriculture practice, and it is business, and it is prestige making, right? So in another wine region in Carema, I saw this beautiful tumble down house. Like, it was so tumble down that I didn't want to buy it, and it was so beautiful that I wanted to buy it. And I was walking around with the head of the cooperative, and it's a cooperative there. And we talked a little bit about cooperatives yesterday. It's a cooperative because nobody really can make wine there independently anymore. And he said, this house is falling down and will always be falling down. And he used the word ruins. He said, because nobody owns this house. In fact, one person owns this room and one person owns that room and somebody else owns the other room, and none of them talk to each other anymore. Because not only do they not get along, but they're of the same family, which may explain why they don't get along. And I thought that was a fascinating thing, that this was now worthless property. And I saw that everywhere, and it demands that kind of new way of thinking, or an older way of thinking about winemaking that was the cooperative. Like, that's the only thing they could do, because in some cases, it had come down to a single vine, right? That one person owned one vine and somebody else owns the vine next to them. And it's a legacy of the brand and all kinds of other things in this world, and hasn't yet, and it hasn't arrived in some of those settler wine regions. But because in many cases, those are corporations, not family businesses, which I don't want to go wine geek in this too much, but I think it's one of the things that I really do need to unpack. It was something that I went to the region expecting to find, great wine alongside this notion of the forest is returned, it's rewild it. And nobody wanted to, nobody used the word trees, just trees. They all said weedy trees. And that way of looking at nature, to me, was the legacy of the ways in which they were thinking about land that was sort of perpetually beyond capitalism.
Can I ask people to identify themselves, because there are people in the room and in the Zoom room who don't necessarily know who the folks in the audience are, and I'm not sure how much they can see or hear. So if you can also proceed closer, no, if you just stand up and go near the owl will hear them.
Pay your obeisance to the beast.
Yeah, the owl has served us very well.
Okay, hi, I'm Janita. I'm from the anthropology department. I'm a PhD student. I have 2 questions. Can I ask 2 questions? Okay, one's for Jeffrey, and the other one is for Jose. So Jeffrey, I was really fascinated by this quick remark that you made about how craft brewers love chemistry tables. And something that I'm working through right now in my research on fermenters at Slow Food is, when is science industrial? When is the science coming from industrial histories? When is it not coming from those histories? And what does that kind of forgetting, remembering, when does that become meaningful in this kind of marketization of craft beer, but also the preference for standardization? So the question is, when is the beer science industrial? When are those things together? And to what extent are those ever different things? And then I had another question for this concept of the meat paradox, as this kind of the shifting, always kind of you can't kind of think about desire and disgust separately when it comes to meat. And of course, as an anthropologist, I immediately think about Mary Douglas's purity and pollution. And I wonder to what extent it's about the meat at all. And it's about the person who is in some sense purifying their motivations through this kind of understanding that what they're eating is polluted. And in so doing, they're kind of turning it from not being disgusting into something being desirous again. If it's really just about kind of the identity of the eater, or to what extent is it about the meat at all? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, so that's a really good question. And so one thing to keep in mind is that beer became industrialized before it became scientific. And partly that was because, you know, brewing chemistry was associated with adultery. And it was really only when they had such a massive investment in these tanks that they had to start, you know, checking, you know, to make sure that they weren't overheating or whatever that would cause, you know, because you have massive losses. And so they had to adopt, you know, thermometers, saccharometers, and all the other kinds of things that get adopted. And so, you know, they're really forced to it. But by the 19th century, and so the 18th century, the 19th century, really some of the leading analytical and theoretical chemists were actually brewers, brewing scientists. In the 20th century with craft beer, what happens is that that craft beer likes to ignore its roots in the industry. And whether you want to talk about all of the professional brewers who work for Anheuser-Busch or whoever that then become craft brewers, or that, you know, I mean, there's just a, you know, the very technology that makes it possible to produce good beer on a small scale comes from the industry. And so, you know, we have these stories within the craft movement. There's, particularly in the United States, but I think more widely as well, that the cultural hero of brewing is a mad scientist, you know, who takes his chemistry set and builds his own brewery. And of course, what that forgets, I mean, there are brewers, successful brewers like Ken Grossman at Sierra Nevada, that did start out with chemistry sets, but then they bought excess capacity from regional brewers that were going bankrupt in this sort of period of consolidation in the 1980s and whatnot. And that's what allowed them to expand and to build, you know, successful craft breweries that become quite big. And so it's so much of that well, like the Lambic, right, you know, is to, you know, imagine the social distinction that comes from, you know, kind of producing this artisanal craft and ignore all of the industry, technology, and science that's there. And so as long as, you know, you're a mad scientist and not, you know, kind of an industrial, you know, quality control person, that it's cool and sort of contributes to the social distinction of the craft movement.
Should I wait for all the wine questions? Okay, thanks for that question.
Sorry, I forgot this was the beverage comment.
It's a good pairing.
Yes. So, well, how will you guys want to handle the meat questions? You want to answer right now or say
Yeah,
it?
we can just get it done.
Yes, yeah. And after that, we have, Paul.
Jose, why don't you jump in on this
Yeah,
and
and
then.
then we return to drink and follow, sorry, and Davide. And yes,
Thanks for that question. Also, it's so nice to see you in person. I think I've only ever seen you on Zoom. So the question about Mary Douglas is a good one. It shows how it's hard to talk about meat in only one discipline.
yeah.
And so the concept of the meat paradox definitely comes from psychology, and I think you could do an anthropological Mary Douglas reading of it. For sure, Mary Douglas has come to our minds a lot in this project. I think it does have to do with the identity of the eater, but I would say that there's something social and cultural going on as well. We came to the topic of meat from our research on foodies, where we noticed that people talked about meat a lot, and meat seems a particularly like triggering food for people to talk about meat in ways that is more emotional than say when they're talking about, I don't know, like yogurt or like lettuce. It brings up more intense emotions. And so I think that there is this element of purity, but I think that there's something also materially significant about the meat and about the fact that it was an animal and that there's death involved. So I think the project has, I don't know about you, Sean, but it's turned me into a materialist. Like, even though it's all like social construction of like happy meat, I also think there's this material element where people are genuinely repulsed by the industrial food system and concerned at some deep emotional, ethical level. And so I think that that's definitely in the mix as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Putting on historian hats, if there are several of us in the room, I think, sensory histories and histories of emotions have been so important, in the field for historians, and I think that is an area, histories of affect and senses, and we have to be visual in there, and Dan would both worked in that direction. I think that's again another intersection, where I can see the insights from your project going really, very broadly. I'm sorry, I forgot that Jeffrey was actually first in queue. And then we had Paolo and Davide, and then we have
two people.
We have
Geeta and then Rafi.
Geeta and Rafi.
Yeah.
Thank you, folks. We have you in the queue.
So my question's for Allison, but I think maybe all of us might sort of think about this thing. And I'm really struck by, the ways in which in Russia, that you have these, well, I mean, the example of Peter the Great and what a lush he was. And yet, this kind of, temperance or even prohibitionist streak that leads the Tsar to, ban alcohol, in still prohibition on, the eve of World War I. And so I'm just kind of thinking about, kind of class, and then certainly in the case of Julie's work of race as well, sort of, how do we, sort of think about, sort of the elite ways of thinking about the masses and drink.
Yeah, I mean, I think and part of the answer is that it's 200 years and a lot changes in 200 years. And there's a really unsuccessful war with Japan, and there were some efforts, so there's a whole bunch of other situational stuff. Part of it is also, I think, a new vision of public health more broadly, and a public health that is both like hygiene and health and also sort of social moral health. That particularly grows over the course of the 19th century, especially at the end of the 19th century. And this is not unusual to Russia. I mean, this is a sort of this is Russia in step with much of the rest of the global north, really. And not just that, we're thinking about, we need to make sure that we have healthy people to fight our wars. We need to make sure that they are, all of these, in a new way from earlier sort of, population politics kinds of things, where this was a very tangential thing. It becomes a really central thing at the end of the 20th century. Part of that is because of some complicated things involving taxes that make the state more explicitly tied to alcohol and its perils in a lot of ways. Part of it is, so there's some very specific governmental stuff that makes it then. But in general, sort of over the course of the 19th century, I think you do see a real change in terms of thinking about how alcohol plays out among the, in Russia, it's mostly they think about the peasants. The working class is such a tiny percentage of the population. It's really a very heavily agrarian society, honestly, until the 1950s. And it's the 1950s when more than half the population no longer lives in rural regions. And so there's this perpetual concern that there are problems in rural society. And what I actually think happens is, in the middle of the 19th century, there starts to be a shift from a sense that peasants are unable to care for themselves. There's a lot of stuff that in other contexts would be racialized language. But it's about them being too simple, them being children, them needing the guiding hand of the landlord or the lord or the noble, the guiding hand or the punishing hand, sort of whatever is sort of making sure that this is this authority that's going to be on top of things. But that kind of has to change in the middle of the 19th century when serfdom is eliminated in Russia. There's a sort of famous comparison that serfdom is abolished in the Russian Empire at almost exactly the same time that slavery is abolished in the US. It's brought a lot of comparisons of varying degrees of depth, I guess I would say. But after that, there starts to have to be the sense that peasants are capable of change, are capable of learning how to manage their own drinking and things like that. And there starts to be this sort of sense that actually we need to be sure that there's like education and there's all of these other things that will create a more self-sustaining and self-managing sort of larger rural population. Now, there's always questions of like, well, but they still can't do it. There's always still these sort of paternalistic sort of views coming in from various people sort of saying, but still there's this problem. Or then it does start to shift to more urban problems later on. So there's a lot of different levels to this basically, but those are some of them.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jeffrey. That's great. I've just, I'm going to speak kind of more broadly to my work in the paper, but I'll just do it quickly. To say this question about temperance and the ideas of class and race, and I mean, they're connected in the Australian situation in that Aboriginal people have only ever been really offered a social position that is on the lowest possible one socially. And the only time Australians of any race have been prohibited from consuming alcohol, it is Aboriginal people. So thinking now about whiteness and race, there was a period in the 1840s, I was thinking about the waves of temperance, and I'll survey them really quickly in New South Wales. So I'm talking about the colony of New South Wales that became the state of New South Wales. So in the 1840s, the colonial elites actually enacted a couple of temperance style laws. And the short version of what happened was essentially the elite political class, which is a group of Anglo people who are essentially imperial agents, and some settler capitalists who are in the kind of emerging legislative environment that's starting to take shape in the 1840s. These guys essentially are cracking down on anybody whose labour is required for the colony. So their drinking is being cracked down upon, but it's the same thing that's happening in Britain, which is that the middle class, of which there is virtually none in Australia, by the way, until the 1970s, but that the middle class can do what it bloody well wants. Is that, yeah, so the rules really only apply to the need to control the labouring classes. And then, this is the last thing I'd say that, so at the same time as prohibition is emerging in the United States, Australia has a version of temperance, and there are some of the same kind of motivations for that, but it takes a very different form in the Australian context. It starts around World War I. It's about creating a contented society. It's around the idea of having to generationally rein in what had been, after our version of the Gilded Age, which we don't call it, but you know, that'll do for a cultural explanation. There was a period of inebriety, basically. I can probably see this in those contexts. You can actually kind of map the booms and busts of drunkenness and sobriety, right? So I would say in Australia, we've had a period of, so temperance is that kind of couple of generations of sobriety. And then it's really interesting because the Australian wine industry really emerges starting in the 1960s on the kind of upswing out of that. And again, the middle class in Australia can kind of do what they want. Not so, in New South Wales, you can't even get a decent glass of wine in a restaurant after 6 p.m. between 1919 and 1955. It's actually appalling. I know, be shocked. Yeah, particularly the Italians. It's shocking. And then, however, in Victoria and South Australia, you could drink wine with dinner until 8 p.m. So that's a kind of bit of room for the wine industry, bit of room for the middle class as well. And the last thing I would say, actually, because the Australian wine industry in Australia is really supply driven, not demand driven in the 19th century, lots of the elite legislators who are experimenters with wine growing in New South Wales, in fact, introduce legislation that is about a lower licensing for wine. And the argument they use comes from, in fact, Lynn Martin, who's done work around drinking and reputations in Europe, that touched on this a little bit, but I also see this in Adam Smith's argument about the idea of particular European, Adam Smith is in Love of Nations, Adam Smith, particular Europeans having a kind of sobriety. Well, this comes up in the 1860s in New South Wales legislation when there's arguments for a Sale of Colonial Wine Act, where this basically pretty rubbish sort of wine that's being made can be sold quite cheaply in places. And the whole point is to create an industry, but the argument that's made is if we can make the working classes that tend to be white British, drunk and angry, if we can make them drink wine, then they'll turn into these sort of contented Spanish, Italian type of people. It didn't happen, horror stories and so on. But yeah, the temperance and class, the short version is in Australia, it's about as well controlling the people upon whom capitalism depends.
Why don't I, it's a great answer, why don't I get some other voices? How's that?
So we have exactly 25 minutes. We have a hard stop. I know we could keep talking forever. So we have our two international visitors, Paolo and Davide, and we have our hybrid participants, Rafi Groslick, who I know as the author of a wonderful book on globalizing organic, and I believe my quick Googling has told me that he is at Ben Gurion University in Israel, and Geeta Sukumaran, who is a Culinaria Food Studies graduate student, but at York University, one of the many Culinaria students of the UFT hasn't let us admit, and who are at universities across the world. So can I ask that each of you ask your questions and also say who they're directed to, and then we can have all the speakers kind of address. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paolo, from Bologna. And two quick questions. The first one is to Alison, and it's quite close to the question Jeffrey already asked. I'm thinking at early Soviet provisionism, and I wanted to ask you if there were severe economic circumstances which forced to use resources for other purposes and so on. But I wanted to ask you if there was a connection between this Soviet debate and the debate in late Imperial Russia, or if this was, or not, if this was the expression of the new project of the new humanity and so on. So this was the question. Then for Daniel, that area of Italy has some historically peculiarities in terms of farming culture. It's closer to France rather than to the rest of Italy because of a high share of independent small owners, and this confirms what you were saying actually. And so the question is, I wonder if you interacting with these people, so if they perceive themselves as a community, or this absence of a cooperative tension, which is quite rooted and widespread and strong in part of Italy, and particularly with social wine sellers, which played a very important role in developing the wine industry in other regions. So how they perceive themselves as a collectivity, as a community, as a people working living there.
Davide?
Okay, thank you. I'm Davide Domenici, anthropologist in the University of Bologna. I also had two quick questions. If they are too much, we can answer separately. The first one to Dan, probably because I was an archaeologist, I was fascinated by your pairing wines and ruins. And yes, ruins speak about demise, about decline, but they also speak about heritage. And so my question would be, in the area you mentioned, did you notice any attempt of heritagization of this decline? Because I'm interested in museum. I've been looking at Valpolicella, and there a lot of families are the driving force of heritagization. The creation of wine museum. Every family basically is organizing its own museum. The objects of their past. So I'm familiar with more the Valpolicella region than the one you're studying. So the question would be, have you noticed any process of heritagization going on? And the other question may be too big, so maybe you can answer. I don't know if there will be time, but for Jeffrey, in your presentation, you mainly spoke about this process of transformation of beer into an industrial commodity in countries where they had a tradition of brewing. And so looking at the process of globalization of beer from my point of view, which is Mexico, and obviously thinking about Cervecería Cuauhtémoc, what about the other part of the process, that is the beer, industrial beer entering markets in countries which did not have a brewing tradition, so, which at least in Mexico occurs at the end of the 19th century. So
if I can add, Turkey is much more an interesting example because of the
Geeta. So Geeta is doing a PhD from York University. I have the privilege of being on a committee on conflict and trauma in literature, especially by and about women from Sri Lanka, but also in the Tamil language. She's also a poet and writer and translator, and working with the Feeding City Lab on our global histories of rights and sustainability. Geeta, over to you.
Hello all. First of all, thank you for this wonderful panel. I have a question for Jose. As I'm thinking through meat between desire and disgust, I was just wondering if your project also includes of those people who cook meat and do not consume meat. Like, is just this category of this kind of, this is also another kind of consumption that lies between desire and disgust? I just wanted to know if your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Can I ask Rafi to unmute and introduce yourself? We are delighted to welcome you to the Culinaria global community. We can't hear you yet. Joe.
It's not on our end.
Sorry.
Sorry, Rafi.
Muted still?
Still
No, can't hear
muted.
you.
Audio input, perhaps, Rafi?
Audio input? Do you want to just type your question and, yeah, sorry about that, but yes, why don't we have
Why don't I
our,
just quickly jump in with an answer to that while Rafi types that?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, perfect. So I actually think that they're deeply connected in the heritagization and these two kinds of questions. Very, very quickly, talk more at once. My sense is that official Savoia policy discouraged cooperatives and discouraged the formation of cooperatives. That's a very, very basic reading in the archives. I think they tried some of them and they quickly failed. And it may be that it was official policy. It may be that they were also drawing them very, that the draw of industry happened so quickly that it was a sort of, let's just get rid of the vineyards and let them grow under. But I do think the contemporary world is a link that I think needs unpacking in the food studies world between these discourses of artisan and craft and the simultaneous project of heritagization, which is all over the region in both wine and industry. My sense is that if we pushed further on this, which I should, that we would find that in all kinds of places, that heritage, and you see it in labels on beer, that heritagization is deeply connected to the same discourses, two-headed monster of these new notions of craft and artisan. But we'll talk some more.
Sure. I just have to say there are, the last time I was in Russia, it was sort of between the annexation of Crimea and the recent war. And one of the responses to the annexation of Crimea was, of course, these sanctions that were placed on Russia, and then Russia placed counter sanctions, which were basically about limiting the import of cheese and sausage and fruits and vegetables and things like that, which was actually then producing this efforts to create like home craft cheese and things like that in Russia that was gonna get, so there was this interesting dairy element to that in the way it developed in Russia, which is sort of fun. Anyway, so the prohibition was a pre-Soviet, that was a late imperial act, so it was definitely Nicholas II. There's one particular sort of temperance supporter who claimed credit for convincing Nicholas to do this. You know, he'd been sort of arguing that he was a self-made man and he'd been able to do this because of his persistent sobriety and everything would be better if everybody was this. The Soviets then do leave it in place for the first half, like through the Civil War into the 1920s. I forget the exact year that prohibition has ended. I want to say it's 1924, but I can't actually remember the specific year. And one of the major reasons that's been said is that they just realized that they lost control of alcohol. That it's only when this prohibition came in that the practice of samogон or home distilled spirits starts to come in, like the bathtub gin idea or whatever, you know, from other prohibition ideas. And so the problem they found was that people were not going to give up their drinking because it was important for, like I talked about poverty and this and that and the other, but of course, the reason people drink is also because it's part of celebrations and festivities and all of these sorts of things. And so people started to make their own, so there's one historian, David Christian, who's written an article about this, and he basically says that what prohibition did was it made it impossible for the Soviet state ever to control alcohol in the way that the imperialists did. There was actually very little, like people would make beer at home, but not do distilled alcohol. So it sort of ends up being this huge problem. And then sort of, you know, there's waxing and waning of attitudes toward drinking over the longer 20th century. There are efforts to sort of build up actually the wine industry in the Soviet Union in parts to combat. A friend of mine from grad school just had the book out called Reds and Whites.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah, I really love it. And about the longue durée of wine in Russian history. But one of the things, you know, there were similar efforts to like, well, if we have wine, then people will drink more wine and less vodka. Like there's all of these things that this will make a more cultured society. And then it sort of culminates with Gorbachev's anti-alcohol policy, which to bring it back to class, you know, one of Gorbachev's opponents sort of explicitly, he said that this was the castration of the working class, was the anti-alcohol policy, because vodka was necessary for the working class for their sociability, for all of these sorts of things. And so sort of that was seen as really a huge problem, and I've heard whole explanations for the downfall of the Soviet Union, starting with that anti-alcohol policy, which I'm not sure I entirely believe, and yet I kind of do at the same time. So there's a lot of ways in which that's sort of true. Like, I keep waiting for Putin to do it, because like Nicholas II did it, and it failed, Gorbachev did it, like, maybe the next.
Yeltsin just drank.
Yeltsin just drank.
That's true.
So let me just very quickly answer WD's question. I appreciate it because I actually only told half the story, right? So, and your question points exactly to how it becomes a global commodity. And it's really, the answer to that is in part, you know, exactly what Julie was talking about how beer, like wine, becomes civilized. And in particular, it's that whole, you know, the taste of it, right? And in particular, Pilsner and its association with purity. And in all of these countries like Mexico and industrial beer is contrasted with the very strong taste of the indigenous beverage puke, which is very strong. And that's true in so many different societies. In the case of Turkey, it's actually just modernity, right? And you have, you know, modern Muslims, including at times sultans, who are drinking beer because, you know, actually Muhammad never said anything about beer. And so clearly that's allowed. And so, but yeah, it's a way of partaking in that modern world. And so beer is encouraged. So, but thank you, that's a good point.
So the floor is yours, Jose and Sean. do however you want to take the questions, and we will wrap up after that.
Shall I
Anyone?
vocalize Rafi's question?
Yes.
Not least because this was my exact question. Did the topic of cultured meat or in vitro meat arise in your focus groups? And how do the people you've been talking to perceive the intersection between the accelerated media attention and hype surrounding meat substitutes, specifically cultured meat, and the concept of the meat paradox, considering the diverse range of emotional responses related to meat consumption? What sociological findings can be imagined in the future after the expected proliferation and dissemination of cultured meat? And I might add, squeezing in, where would cultured meat fit? Is it happy meat, good meat, weird meat?
So thank you, Geeta and Rafi. It's nice to see both of you. I'll just start with Geeta's question. That would be a fascinating research project to look at people who cook but do not consume meat. It definitely would have a gendered element, I'm guessing, that came up in some of my previous research on food and femininity, where women would talk about how they were previously vegetarian, but ended up cooking meat for their families and for their partners because they preferred meat. I can't say that came up in the focus group. Instead, it was almost the opposite. People would try to minimize how much meat they ate. And they would talk about how they didn't cook it very much, but then through the course of the interview, it became clear that they cooked more meat than they might have let on at the beginning. But there's definitely more common to eat meat outside the house, but not want to touch it inside the house. On the topic of alternative meat, we didn't pitch that in the focus groups, and it didn't come up as a topic. And I also would just say sociologists are the worst at predicting the future, so I can't say that's the last part of your question. But it's such an interesting twist to talk about it. How would it be happy or not? I have to think about that. I think environmentally, I was really blown away in the focus groups by how much passion and knowledge people had about the environmental implications about eating meat. I think that has become quite a mainstream notion that meat is associated, especially beef, is associated with environmental bads. So I can only cautiously project that I think it would be happy meat and that it would be considered pro-environmental, but I think there still is a gross factor for some people. I don't know, Sean.
Maybe happy weird.
Happy weird.
Yeah.
Happy weird. That's funny.
The criteria for weird, for sure, I think. Well, and so we did have one question on the survey, but again, the survey was fielded in 2019. Nobody actually had access to it, so it's sort of people are imagining that when they're not actually faced with a real choice. But I just did a quick cross tab with gender, and it meets like the rest of the weird meats. It's almost 2 to 1, right? Women are twice as likely to say that they would not be comfortable eating black meat. So I think there's something going on there, but on the other hand, we didn't get a chance to ask, do they find it happy? But you can imagine how they would, right? On environmental grounds, that's how it's being justified. So it's happier for us. It's definitely, there's no death involved, right? So we're making some theoretical animal happier by not being killed. But how people would end up weighing those, like the weirdness versus the animal rights and environmental advantages it's a great question. We didn't actually get a chance to explore that with people. So yeah, predicting the future, it's a real unknown. What I can say is that I don't see a lot of people rushing out to get it right now.
The 2 last questions about fish, for example, or other type of meats that are not like mammals. Because people always like, oh, it's so cute. The animals that you want to pet are considered like, often closer and hence more people may be more concerned about their happiness than eating fishes.
You had oysters in that list. And I would say that as a historian, that was one of my, kind of things that came to mind, that those types of protein have changed historically, right? Oysters were something that you had in those indentured labor contracts. They shouldn't be given oyster and lobsters more than, a couple of times, because they were the cheap trash protein. And of course, now you have that. But that is also what I think, just to kind of say that I think there are all these fascinating questions about gender and labor, running through a lot of the papers, which we don't have time to address now. So for instance, in Allison's presentation, I'm sure she addresses it in her larger work, but also even on that point, riffing on what Peter asked, because I can imagine that, yes, this is a question, and often it's women who are cooking, those meat, fish, and not eating them, but it's also professionals. So I can think of a whole lot, especially in Toronto, because a lot of the people at the back end of the kitchen are families. And, and not all families are vegetarian, it's mostly concentrated in upper class, but there are going to be people who are vegetarian, vegan, younger chefs, and we know. And so again, there is this kind of fascinating way, I think, where, it is tropes of gender and class and labor play in there. And also I'm thinking of the disgust, because you're outsourcing that disgust to the person whose job it is to cut the meat. Right, because again, that's another thing to factor in. These have been absolutely fascinating. If I can make a couple of housekeeping.
Do you want to give them a chance to answer that?
Yeah.
Nino's question?
Yeah, of course. Yes, we do have time for that, and then housekeeping.
We didn't ask enough about the cute animals, but we know from other people's research that makes a big difference, and even from the psychology research, the way that people are presented with options makes a big difference in terms of how appealing they are, depending on how grossed out they'll be. Like if you show like the availability of like meat with the head still attached, right, like, that makes a huge difference in terms of who's going to be willing to eat it.
Yeah, and it's definitely a hierarchy of mammals, and then birds and fish go farther down the hierarchy of people's willingness to kill and eat them. So previous work in psychology has affirmed that hierarchy, and we definitely saw that in the focus group. And there's also a place-specific nature to it as well. So in the British Columbia focus groups, people ask a lot about fish. Why aren't you studying fish? Fish is really important to us. And we honestly hadn't thought about it. And in terms of our short proposal, we just focused on pork, pigs, chickens, and cows. And in the survey, we added a few more just for variety.
I wanted to point out here to everyone, a couple of housekeeping points that we have here from Youth Directions and Food Studies, from our wonderful collaborator, Professor Michael Classens, and our as wonderful postdoctoral scholars who are in this room today, tomorrow, in the third and final morning of this hybrid symposium. So Zoom audience, we hope to see you again. I hope more students and faculty from Bologna and from other spaces will be there. Joe will be manning the Zoom stations. However, we are going to be meeting in a different room in Victoria College, which is the Northrop Frye Center, which I've been told is different from the Northrop Frye building. So since I'm directionally challenged,
It's right downstairs.
it is downstairs.
It's right in the lobby downstairs here. So don't plug it into your things, because I will send you across the courtyard. Right downstairs in this building, you'll see a big sign downstairs. Northrop Frye Center, right in the lobby.
Right, and the Northrop Frye Center is again another part of Victoria College, and